You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Some of the advanced numbers are out now on Justin Fields and his rookie season, showing a lot of special moments and some really big highs, and also some very legitimate reasons for concerns and where some of the struggles really ended up, leaving Fields kind of somewhere in this middle of a volatile quarterback with some highs and lows and some questions about what that means for the future. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. Keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and every day. On the show today, we dive into Justin Fields' rookie season more by the numbers. In particular, just on Monday, the Pro Football Focus Quarterback Annual came out, where they put out a lot of their data on quarterbacks across the NFL. And we go through a lot of specifics about where the good throws were, the bad throws were, how quickly he's getting rid of the ball, how far downfield he's throwing the ball, where his accuracy is, how he goes through his reads and his progressions, and where the receivers were running their routes, where Justin Fields was throwing relative to where the Bears offense was asking him to throw, what he was doing situationally, and even some of how that compares to Andy Dalton. So there's a lot of different ways you can slice the Justin Fields evaluation. And I think the big point that it's left me with is that you can kind of slice it any way that you want, right? It's almost a Rorschach test of quarterback evaluations. When you look at Justin Fields' season, you can really match whatever you thought your eye test was going to be for Fields, whatever your opinion was of him during the season. You can look at most of the quarterbacking data, especially in this PFF Quarterback Annual, and you can find the numbers to kind of support your position either way. You can find the numbers to say, oh man, he had a really bad rookie season, and there was all these different data points that kind of show how he was towards the bottom of the league and very nearly the bottom of the league in terms of quarterbacking at some very key, accuracy metrics. And we'll get into some of those things a little bit later in the show. But then there are also enough of those positive signs in there that we could see on tape from Justin Fields also, you can find the numbers for and say, oh, well, here's all the key ways he was actually really good in some of these key situations and key moments that you could then say that's your evidence as to why things are going to get better and why you should have faith in Justin Fields, right? You can sort of find things in both directions. And I thought the PFF Quarterback Annual document they put out, it's a giant, think NFL draft guide, but only looking at every NFL quarterback. Each QB gets a write-up, and I thought the one that PFF did for Justin Fields, it's just a quick paragraph, really, I think, summarized it well in a very fair way between those two ideals, or those two outcomes that I was just describing there of finding whatever you want to fit your narrative. I think the write-up seems to kind of go right down the middle. They wrote, and I quote, Fields played a high-variance brand of football as a rookie that led to plenty of highlights and lowlights. His average time to throw and depth of target were one of the highest among qualifying quarterbacks, which contributed to high big-time throw and turnover-worthy play rates. Between his arm talent and elite rushing ability for the position, which Chicago would be well-suited to tap into more in 2022, Fields has all the physical tools a team could want. It's easy to get excited about what he could develop into. The two biggest areas the Bears would like to see some growth next season is accuracy, an area where he excelled at Ohio State, and play under pressure, though Fields did improve in the latter category as the season progressed. So I think that's a very fair and balanced way of sort of saying, yes, there were very real accuracy issues and taking too many sacks and pressures and some of the things that we saw. But then also there were some big time, literally the PFF metric is big time throws. They call, these downfield tight window vertical passing throws that are just more difficult than your average throw, that he was able to hit a lot of those things. But along the way, there was also some issues with, putting the ball in harm's way and again, taking some of those sacks and where the positives and the negatives sort of ranged on that spectrum. So, right, in terms of how Pro Football Focus splits them between the big time throws and the turnover worthy throws, the best of the best and the worst of the worst throws, he had the second highest rate of the best throws. Like among quarterbacks, he was hitting the best throws, the second best among out of all 32 quarterbacks. The rate with which he was doing and successfully hitting those downfield big time throws was second best in the NFL. But the rate with which he was having the worst throws, the turnover worthy throws, was 23rd. So what would that put, like 10th worst, or bottom 10, right in that range of where he ranked in the plays that could have led into turnovers. So you're getting the absolute top of the cream of the crop type throws, and then you're also getting some of the questionable, not as great, not where you want it to be necessarily type throws either, which is, again, you could sort of say, well, is that's understandable for a rookie, right? But then is it also a sign of things to get worse or things to get better, right? That's where you could spin it in either direction that you want to look at. They break it down a little bit more granular than that, not just like the top of the top good and the bottom of the bottom bad, but they rate every throw as either really positive, neutral, negative, or very negative, on sort of that type of a scale. And you could just look at just his positive versus his negative. You just take out all the easy completions, a check down neutral throw, right? The little 3-yard curl route on 1st and 10, that's a neutral throw, as opposed to like being inaccurate and getting a negative throw or hitting a nice positive downfield throw. And he was, I think, 3rd highest in positive throw rate and 3rd highest in negative throw rate. So again, this idea of volatility where he's having a lot of the really, really good plays and probably too many of the bad plays. And so the question sort of then becomes, how correctable do you think that is? How fixable is that? How developable is that? Is there a foundation there that you feel like, what, can you keep the positives and reduce the negatives? And what maybe caused some of the negatives? And are those causes, treatable, repairable, correctable, or are they a sign of, bad habits that are going to be difficult to remove? I tend to fall on the side of, and my mantra for Fields this season, whenever anybody's asked me about it on any interview or even just at the bar talking to people, right? It seemed to me that Fields did all the difficult things and made the difficult things look really easy. But then some of the things that are supposed to be easy, he made look more difficult. And I tend to come from the philosophy that it's easier to make the easy things easy than it is to make the difficult things easy. And so if he's already got the more difficult things, the downfield passing, the big plays, that's hard to teach. I think it's easier to teach some of the easier things that he struggled with a little bit in this past season. And we'll go through a little bit more specifically of like where some of those struggles were in terms of like accuracy and completion percentage and something, going through sort of reads and progressions and how that all sort of came together before we then get into how the way the Bears used him influenced that and some of the different takeaways we can get from routes and heat maps and all the different target data that we can get next on Locked On Bears. Well, just because we don't have football anymore doesn't mean you can't make your sports viewing still just as exciting when you lay a little bit of money down and have some action on these games in other sports. It's that much more fun. And our friends at betonline.net are going to be the top spot for all of your sports betting needs, from all the latest odds, totals, player performance props, to where the next fired coach is going to land. Basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. Maybe we'll get a baseball season if the lockout is going to end at some point. Plus, hockey, soccer, tennis, boxing, UFC odds. Of course, they just got done with so much Olympic coverage and information. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports, scores, podcasts, and news throughout every sports season. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the different trends and action you need to know, because BetOnline is where the game starts. If someone's looking for a place to be particularly critical of Justin Fields, particularly you think like certain Packers fans or Packers media members or whoever wants to troll you about Justin Fields, right away they're going to go toward his accuracy data. And of course, accuracy is really important. And so, yes, being inaccurate is bad. There's some validity to this, right? There's legitimately were accuracy concerns and issues with Justin Fields. And as we noted sort of at the beginning with the write-up from PFF, that accuracy was one of his strengths at Ohio State, which would leave you to think there's A, room for that to improve in the NFL, and B, perhaps other factors in Chicago this past season that contributed to some of that lack of accuracy. But it's important to note that when we're talking about accuracy here, it is irrespective of whether or not the player caught the ball. So they chart accuracy based on, when the ball gets to the wide receiver, where on his body and on his frame is the ball when the ball gets there. Is it over the number's chest, or if and also it does change based on what direction the receiver is moving, right? So if the receiver's moving left to right, then an accurate ball slightly in front of him to hit him in motion is better than if he's standing still. You don't want it in front of him. So they do high, low, front, back, chest, too far behind, too far below, overthrow, underthrow, all these different sort of areas of accuracy. And Justin Fields' accurate pass rate was 31st out of 32 quarterbacks. I mean, just generally speaking, his accuracy was, and this is not completion percentage, we're talking accuracy on those throws. How catchable passes, right? He had the highest rate of uncatchable passes. Like, no one threw more uncatchable passes than Justin Fields last season. And only one quarterback had a lower accurate pass rate, only because there's different levels of accuracy. They do like pristine accuracy versus like catchably inaccurate. And so like other quarterbacks had more catchable inaccurate passes. He was 25th in there, but 31st in accuracy, 32nd in uncatchable pass rate. And it's interesting specifically in there, the granular data that's so fascinating for me with Justin Fields' accuracy is specifically where he was accurate and inaccurate, because they also break down his accuracy by how far downfield and where on the field he is throwing those balls. And so when you look at where his specific depth accuracy issues were, at throws 20 yards plus downfield, he was above average. He was, I think, 6.1% above average on 20 plus yard throws. Like, he was one of the more accurate quarterbacks throwing 20 plus yards downfield. And even at the 10 to 19 yard range, he was average to above average in that range of that sort of intermediate zone. So like the deeper passes, which should be the more difficult throws to hit, 20 plus yards downfield, those are the impressive, tough downfield throws that can make or break an offense and can be these game-changing type plays. He had above average and significantly above average accuracy on those throws. The problem is, in the grand scheme of the offense, right, those throws don't represent a significant percentage of his targets. I think it represented 17% of his throws were in that range, and his accuracy percentage on those throws was phenomenal, but that's only 17% of his throws. And the problem is, where his accuracy was far, far below average was on the shortest throws, on the depth range of 0 to 9 yards beyond the line of scrimmage. He was 10% below average accuracy. So whatever the accuracy rate is for the average quarterback, if it's 70% or whatever, he was 10% below that. I mean, one of the least accurate quarterbacks on what should be easy 0 to 9 yard throws, just past the line of scrimmage, curls, check downs, some of those types of things. He was a lot less accurate than the average quarterback in those spots. And those represented 49% of his throws. So you can see where if most of his throws are short underneath and he's inaccurate on an abnormal percentage of those, it brings down the overall accuracy number. And you can see where if you're someone, outside of Chicago in particular, that's like looking at Justin Fields and saying, wow, this kid is really inaccurate on the really easy throws. He must not be any good, right? Or there's some real concerns there. And like, yeah, it is a real concern. You should be accurate on those easy underneath throws. But I think the perspective question comes, it's like, okay, well, what is more concerning to you, or how fixable do you feel like it is? Because again, really highly graded and accurate on the downfield throws outside the numbers on both sides of the field, and particularly in the intermediate area to the outside. But then, one of the lowest graded quarterbacks and lowest accuracy on those underneath middle of the field type throws. And you look at, like, we'll get into in a second, like his route data and where he was choosing to throw these passes and how that plays into some of this. But what as a Bears fan, as a football analyst, as whatever perspective you're taking when you're looking at Justin Fields, how fixable do you think that is? Hitting short underneath passes. That would seem to me like something that should be fairly repairable. Not that it's easy, quote unquote, or not that it's simple that everyone does it, but just it would seem like it would be harder to teach a quarterback to hit those downfield throws really accurately. That seems like it would be almost impossible to teach someone. Like, you just sort of have to, have that special playmaking ability and get that. Whereas throwing the curl route or the little underneath crossing route or the slant or whatever it might be seems like something that's easier to practice and replicate and really get the repetitions into building that up. The other area where Fields was below average that will need to have some work through it was going through progressions. He ended up throwing to his first read on 73% of his passes, and that's above average, as in higher than the average quarterback in terms of how often they were staying on their first read. He got to his next read 9% of the time, check downs 5% of the time, scramble drills 6% of the times, and then like screens and other like predetermined passes, RPOs, was 7% of the time. So he wasn't throwing past his first read as much as the average quarterback. I don't think that's inherently saying it was because he couldn't get past his first read or was having trouble reading beyond the first read, because there are other causes beyond that. And that's the key thing with a lot of this data is like what happened on the field, not caused it. And it's up to open interpretation on what caused it. And that's so much of where these debates will go when it comes to Justin Fields and his development and what was the reason why his accuracy was low or why he was still on his first read a bit much. All of it, I think, in terms of the concerning side of things, is very easy to just say, well, it's one season and it was not even a full season. So it's a little bit of a slow sample size. And I don't think any of it is a referendum or a verdict on what Justin Fields is going to be as a quarterback as he develops moving forward. But it is the first sort of data we get to work with. And then, we certainly will look to compare that to year two, right? And if after year two, we see a lot of these sort of similar issues in accuracy and in progressions, then we can start to have the conversation of like, okay, we need to see more progress. But of course, this is just sort of establishing those baselines in year one. And now year two is where we look to see, okay, where can we take some of those steps forward? And I think those steps can and should come by ideally a better offensive coaching staff, putting him in a better position to be successful under Luke Getsy. We'll take a look at what the data shows about kind of where the Bears offense was missing the mark in terms of supporting Justin Fields properly next on Locked On Bears. It's really important that the Chicago Bears get all the right parts around Justin Fields' coaching staff and roster. And if you're looking for the right parts for your vehicle, our friends at rockauto.com are the top place we will always recommend for any of your auto parts needs, because there's so many different makes and models, and of course 1,000 different parts for anything that could go wrong in any of your vehicles. So it's impossible for, say, like the local chain store or the auto parts store in your town to stock all the parts that you need. So if you go in and you talk to them, they're going to ask you a bunch of pointless or sometimes like intimidating questions about, is it an LX or an EX or an LTD or all these different things. And then the person behind the counter, they'll go look in the back, or they got to punch it in their computer and order it. And then you only get to pick like the brand that their warehouse happens to carry. But our friends at rockauto.com have all the different parts you could possibly need for your vehicle. Their selection is incredible, but it's really easy to navigate. You just enter in your car's make and model, and then you can sort between all the different brands, specifications, and prices that you prefer for your parts. Don't spend up to twice as much for the same parts somewhere else. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. When you check out, write the words "locked on" in their "How did you hear about us" box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. One of my favorite parts of this PFF QB annual document, the guide, it's like a draft guide for just NFL quarterbacks, is some of the data that's not even necessarily like specifically QB specific, I guess, or individualized. How about that? But for each quarterback, they have route heat maps, essentially like showing a diagram of the field and showing where more often or less often first of all, the receivers were running routes, where their routes took them, and then also where the quarterbacks were throwing the routes, or where the quarterback targets were aimed, obviously when they're throwing the target, they're throwing to a receiver or an intended receiver there, but you can kind of find the differences between the two of like, okay, players tend to be running their routes here. Did the quarterback tend to be throwing the ball more so where the players were more often running their routes, or was there more of a discrepancy there? And I think some really key things stood out to me with Justin Fields and comparing him to Andy Dalton when we talk about this Bears offense. So you look at Andy Dalton's heat map of where he was throwing his passes, and most often middle of the field around the 10-yard mark, and then to the sideline around the 5 to 10-yard mark, and some underneath stuff right at and behind the line of scrimmage are where a lot of the red, most above average, more often high frequency passing, middle of the field between the numbers around the 10-yard mark, and some shorter outside stuff. And then you look at where the routes were that Andy Dalton was passing to. Middle of the field around the 10-yard mark was the most concentrated area of where the Bears receivers were running routes specifically for Andy Dalton. So this is only the plays where Andy Dalton is the quarterback. You see the routes and sort of the frequency of where those routes are run. And it's behind the line of scrimmage, middle of the field, and then right around the 10-yard mark, a line like from between the numbers, from the 10 number to the 10 number, all the way across the middle is this big red area of that's where the highest frequency of the Bears routes were run, 10 yards downfield, middle of the field. You go to Justin Fields, right? Different quarterback, very different skill set, right? We know Dalton is the short check down passer, and that's what his targets seem to indicate. And that's where the routes seem to be, in that short check down area for Andy Dalton. That's how the Bears offense was for Dalton. So you would think then, when you put in a quarterback like Justin Fields, more of a downfield thrower, not so much a quick 3-step drop underneath passing type quarterback, that the routes that the Bears receivers ran would reflect that. But no, instead, with Matt Nagy and Bill Lazor, the route heat map it's not identical. You can tell they're different, but it's very, very similar. Essentially, the Bears coaches were asking Bears receivers to run routes to pretty much the exact same areas of the field for Andy Dalton as they did for Justin Fields. And yet, Justin Fields' target heat map of where he's actually throwing the ball is completely different. So most of Justin Fields' targets were all outside of the numbers on either side, but vertically too. So anywhere from 5 to 20 yards is where the highest frequency of Justin Fields' passes went, outside of the numbers. And the lowest frequency of passes was the area over the middle of the field. And yet the routes that they were running for Justin Fields were still highest in that middle of the field area. So they kept running routes to the areas that they did for Andy Dalton that were also the areas that Justin Fields was not typically throwing to. Wherever they were running the routes to, he tended to have to wait for receivers to get elsewhere on the field, and had to find, not the designated intended players perhaps over the middle of the field in that short area, because that's not the type of quarterback that Justin Fields is. That's not where his skill set has been most, utilized, where it's been most effective. And so that, to me, signals a pretty clear, misunderstanding or misuse of Fields' skill set, and could lead to some of those potential accuracy issues when they're having the receivers go to the areas of the field where Fields is less comfortable or less effective, and having him try to throw those passes with less accuracy. Not that he was perfectly accurate throwing to the sidelines. There was still plenty of inaccuracy there too, but it just seems pretty clear that they did not switch the offense much to tailor to Justin Fields' skill set under Matt Nagy and Bill Lazor, and just how underprepared they were for Justin Fields. Because you still see, when you look at some of his other numbers where he was able to have some real success, his passer rating on some of those longer developing throws really was impressive, and above average completion, above average passer rating, above average passer rating in the red zone. Again, an area where it's very hard typically for quarterbacks to excel in the red zone. And Fields I don't think he threw an interception in the red zone, and obviously big touchdowns, big passer rating, big time throws, and all that stuff was effective in the red zone. Very, very effective on play action. The Bears just didn't use very much play action with Justin Fields. Instead, it was very much, trying to force him into being that short underneath quick 3-step drop type quarterback that he just wasn't at Ohio State. That's not what they really asked him to do, and that wasn't where he had the success. Whereas that is what Andy Dalton does well, and where Andy Dalton had some of his success. And so that's why, I think you had the debate of maybe Dalton looks better at times in the Bears offense because they built the offense for Andy Dalton and didn't build it for Justin Fields. So all of that would seem to suggest that a new offensive coordinator and a new coaching staff that better builds an offense for Justin Fields should, in theory, be able to better utilize his skill set, maximize those downfield passing strengths and outside the numbers where he was having success, and minimize some of these short, intermediate, middle of the field type throws where his accuracy was less. and be able to then mitigate some of the concerns that we might have or some of the very real data points that were below average and maximize the things that he was able to do well and give yourself a pretty darn high quality quarterback. And as a result, that just seems to be like, maybe that's my Rorschach test, right? I said at the beginning with this Justin Fields data, you can find what you're looking for if you look for it, and you can downplay the things that don't agree with what your narrative is going to be, and you can you can play up the things that do agree with your narrative. And I'm trying to be very sort of cautious about that because I do acknowledge, like, yes, he was not very accurate on the throws that he should have been easily more accurate at, and he needs to improve his accuracy on those throws, and he needs to get through his progressions a little bit more quickly. He certainly needs to take fewer sacks. He held onto the ball too long. He left the pocket sometimes when he didn't, and he needs to either throw it away more in that case, or just take when he sees a receiver that's maybe not as open as he wants, but it's earlier in the play. Take what's there sometimes, as opposed to trying to extend the play to be the hero and to make the big dynamic play every single time. There's certainly room for that, and that's what makes him great. I'm not going to tell him to never do that or anything, but just slowly work on deciding what's open and being able to just step in and sometimes just get rid of the ball for the sake of getting the ball to a receiver and letting the receiver make a play, as opposed to trying to do too much heroics before you release the pass, right? I want to use the legs more. I want to get him out of the pocket more. I want to make life easier on Justin Fields and not make him have to scramble for 5 seconds before heaving it downfield to a perfect ball to Darnell Mooney. Those are great, but like, can you build your whole offense around that? Maybe not particularly. Those are supposed to be like the cherry on top, the icing, the sprinkles, the nuts on whatever on your sundae you want to be on top there. But you still need like that base level of either the cake or the ice cream here, of like making the easier throws, right? And then he can do the spectacular things on top of it when he needs to, but let's not make him need to do that every other throw behind a bad offensive line and no running game and all those other issues. That's why it's going to be so critical to see how the Bears build around him in terms of personnel, what the coaching staff wants to do from a scheme and playbook standpoint. And you can be sure, as we find out more and more all throughout this offseason, we'll break it all down for you 5 days a week right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and every day. If you're looking for your second listen, more NFL coverage from the Locked On NFL podcast, plus Peacock and Williamson here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We have your team covered every single day. I hope you'll come back tomorrow for more Bears talk, and I hope the Locked On Bears podcast will make it that much easier for you to bear down.